Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam, Hilchos Gezeilah Aveida, Perek Yud Aleph, Halacha Aleph. The Rambam says as follows: Hashav Aveida LiYisrael Mitzvahs Aseh. Returning a lost object to a fellow Jew is a positive commandment. Shenemar, because it says, Hashav Teshivim Lachicha, you shall return it to your brother. Then the Rambam adds, V'haraya Aveidas Yisrael, V'nisalam Mimena, someone who sees a lost object of a fellow Jew and he hides from it, he ignores it, and he leaves it, violates a negative commandment. And he brings the pasuk that you're not allowed to see the ox of your brother and hide from it. And then he adds, Ubita mitzvahs aseh. He also nullifies, he did not observe a positive commandment. Why? Because it's also a mitzvah of Hashav Teshivim, you shall return it. So he violates a negative commandment, says he shouldn't hide, ignore it, and he didn't do the mitzvah of returning the lost object. V'im Heshiva, and if he did return it, Kayim mitzvah saseh, he fulfilled the positive commandment. So commentaries point out that the Rambam holds that just by seeing the Aveida and ignoring it, you violate not only the negative commandment, which the Torah says clearly, v'salamta, you hide from it, you ignored it, but you're also in violation of the positive commandment. Now, other Rishonim, the Ramban and others hold that the only time you violate the positive commandment is if you actually picked it up and you didn't return it. But by just seeing it, you're not in violation of the positive commandment. The negative commandment, you are. But the Rambam makes it clear that it's also applies, this law of seeing it also applies to the mitzvah saseh. And there are several questions that are asked on this Rambam. For example, the halacha is that if you picked up the Aveida and the owner gives up hope, he's miyayish, you can't keep it. If you keep it, you're violating the law. Why? Because you already had the obligation of returning it. So yiyush, which normally helps, doesn't help over here. But the Gemara in Bava Metzia Daf Chavav Amid Beis says clearly that if a person waited until the owner gave up hope, he didn't pick it up, he just sees it, and he waits until the owner gives up hope, he's over on loy sucha lehisalim. He violated that law. But it doesn't say that he's chayiv b'hashava, that he has to return it. There's no chayiv hashava, because there's a yush. He's only over on the law that he violated the law that says you're not allowed to hide from it, you're not allowed to ignore it. But if, according to the Rambam, just by seeing it you violate the mitzvah saseh of returning it, what's the difference between the case of whether you picked it up and there was yush, or the case of where you didn't return it, you just saw it and you didn't return it? According to the Rambam, yush shouldn't help, and it seems that yush does help. It just means that you violated the law of lesucha lesalim, but the mitzvah of hashava you didn't violate. Another question. There's a halacha, later on the Rambam brings it in Perek Yud Aleph, halacha Yud Gimel, that if a person finds something and he's a chacham or a zaken, he's dignified and it's not his custom to take things like this, even if it would be his own thing, he wouldn't make an effort to have it restored, he's pater from returning it. However, the Rambam adds in halacha Yekisha, and he spurs it on, in other words, he did an act already with it, he has to take care of it, and he has to make sure that it gets back to its owner, even though it's not according to his covet, because he started the mitzvah. Now, if, according to the Rambam, the chiyuv of returning already begins by just seeing it, so what's the difference between seeing it and taking it and spurring it on? In both cases, there's a chiyuv hashava. The chiyuv hashava begins not when you pick it up, it begins when you just saw it. And yet, when you see it, if you're zaken or eino lefi chvayda, you don't have to return it. So why over here, just because you started returning it, why should it be any different? According to the other Rishonim, no, there's a big difference. When you see it, there's no chiyav hashava, there's only a lav, lisuchal hisalim. So the answer in the name of Rav Chaim of Brisk is given that there's two separate obligations the Rambam holds. Yes, the Rambam holds that when you see it, you have to return it. There's a chiyav hashava, not just a lav, lisuchal hisalim, but also the esav hashav teshivim, you have to return it. And when you pick it up, you have to return it, but there's a difference. When you see it, the chiyuv hashava is like a mitzvah that a Jew has, like to put on tefillin. There's a mitzvah that the Torah says when you see something that is lost, you have to return it. That's not a chiyuv mammon. It's not a financial obligation. It doesn't, a financial obligation, you borrow money, you have a financial obligation to return it, not just a moral, spiritual obligation, a mitzvah, like putting on tefillin. But in this case, when you see it, the Torah gives you a mitzvah that you have a commandment to return it. Masha'en came, by contrast, when you pick it up, that creates a chiyuv mama. You become like a shamer, you become like a guard where there are financial obligations, because you're no longer just obligated to do it because there's a mitzvah, you're obligated to do it because there's a chiyuv mammon. And that's the difference. When you just saw it, and then there's Yiyush helps, because there was no obligation on you, no financial obligation. Once you pick it up and there's a financial obligation, Yiyush doesn't help, because you become obligated. Your obligation devolves on your property, on your financial status. Also, when a zaken, if he sees it, he has a mitzvah to return it, but if it's not lefi chvayda, there's no mitzvah. The mitzvah doesn't apply. Because the Torah itself hints that sometimes you can hide your face. That means sometimes you don't have the chiyuv of the mitzvah. But once it becomes a financial obligation, then just because it's not lefi chvayda, it doesn't help, because there's already a financial obligation on you, and that cannot be rescinded just because it's not according to your covenant.